What story is shaping how you view the world right now? In a world that seems to be in complete upheaval, what story are you finding yourself living in right now? We are always called to believe some story, some narrative that claims to be the true interpretation of the facts. So is the world just going to hell in a handbasket right now? Is the coronavirus the final word in human history? Is it going to bring the end? Who gets the final say on these questions? Whose word gets to interpret the facts for us right now? So what I want to ask right now is, how does the story of God speak into our lives right now? In this moment in history, how does the story of God not only speak into our lives, but actually give us a framework by which to understand what is actually happening? In our life at Redemption Church, we talk a lot about the story of God, which claims to be the true story of the world and of human history. In the Bible, we don't just find a collection of random stories, but rather we find one comprehensive story that claims to be the dominant story of all time for all people. The story of God, as found in the Bible, actually calls us to understand the world as it is telling the story, as it is giving us the true depiction of reality, which is what all of us so desperately want to know right now, in a time when we are daily being bombarded with new facts and new fears. So in the story of God, if we were to just quickly walk through it, what do we see? We see that God has built this world to be his home, to be his dwelling place with his people. He made this world in such a way that men and women were to join with him in the work of preparing this to be the place that God and man would dwell together in love and in freedom and in life together. But as soon as God gave man their next steps, humans fell into temptation, into seduction by the enemy of God's people, Satan, the accuser, the one who now has brought death and sin into this world. This death is not just a one-time death at the end when we die, but no, this death includes all of our self-worship and includes the slow decay of our bodies that we are experiencing even right now. Even as we see this reign of death seemingly advancing in the wake of the coronavirus, we see that that is the reign of death that was inaugurated when man and woman disobeyed God. But what does the story of God tell us next? It tells us that God does not abandon his creation. He does not abandon his people. After the first man and woman failed, God then began to call a succession of people to follow him, to be his special people in the world, to help rebuild the world and claim it as God and man's co-dwelling. Soon God had a whole nation of people who were his own, who worshiped him and followed him, but yet again, they gave into self-worship. They gave into the deception of Satan, and the reign of sin and death continued. And so then what do we see again? God will still not abandon or forsake his people, but that God himself, we see in the story, is so deeply committed to them that he himself steps into the lives of his people by becoming one of them, to be their representative. In the person of Jesus, the story shows us, God himself steps in and intervenes on behalf of his people. In Jesus, God himself takes on the present reign of sin and death and defeats them by swallowing them up whole at the cross. And then, beginning the launch of God's new creation, when Jesus stepped out of the grave into a new creation body. So the cross and resurrection are not just events that took place in the story. They're not just another story in a succession of stories. No, the cross and resurrection were signals to all of the world for all of time that God's new reign on his new creation has already started. And then Jesus now has a people who represent that new creation to the whole world, and that's the church. He has called us as the church to be a people who show what it looks like when God himself is their king. And we are called in all of life to live life together as we anticipate the day that that new creation will be here in full, and the reign of Satan and death is going to be put away forever. You see, this story isn't just stories from the Bible, but actually shapes how we view what is happening in the world right now. In a world that seems to be falling apart right now and overwhelmed with the coronavirus, we can know that this is actually a continued effect of the fall and of the reign of death. This virus right now is very much being used by Satan because death and fear are waging war against God's people and against the world. So when we know this, when we see the story, begin to interpret the facts in that way, that gives us a grounding in a time when so many people are asking questions that they don't know the answers for. The story of God also then shows us that God isn't going to abandon his people, but that in Jesus we actually can be people right now who have courage, who experience perpetual renewal, and who actually still live in hope. Because Jesus has promised us that we're going to walk through fires, we're going to walk through storms, we're going to walk through difficulties, but that he is going to be with us to the very end of the age. In Jesus, we know how the story ends. We know that death and Satan do not get the final word. We know that in the end, Jesus wins. Death stings us right now, and we see and we experience the pain of it. The story of God shows us, though, that death and Satan are not in charge, but that Jesus wins. So this means that now we, the church, we take our cues from the story. We, the people of Jesus, are those who right now live as servants and agents of peace and renewal in this time. We can be people who aren't arrogant. We don't need to act like we're above fear because we are afraid. And these are scary times that we live in. But we are people who have a story that goes deeper than our fears. We have a story that actually cultivates hope and renewal in us. We can then be people who seek the advantage and betterment of the world, of our friends, of our neighbors right now, even if it means cost or hurt to us. Because the story of God tells us that we are servants and priests in this time. And this is what, church, Jesus is doing in this time. He is stirring us up, stirring up his church again to become who we already are. To be a faithful and even imaginative people in this time as we seek to be Jesus' church together. We are a people who take our cues from the story. And the Spirit of Jesus is showing us how we now continue to find our place in that story. So ask yourself, what story am I living in right now? Not what do I feel, what do I hear, but what story is actually true right now? When you wake up, when you put your head on your pillow at night, when you watch the news, what story is shaping how you're viewing the world right now?